my responsibility is to introduce Cardinal Tobin to you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on dates and statistics. You can find them on the Newark Archdiocesan website, as I did. But what I've done is organize some of the points, just to have those of you who perhaps do not know the Cardinal, give you a bit of a sense of the map of his life. Probably the most important thing, and some might say more important than being a Cardinal, is that he's from Detroit. We're very, very proud. Cardinal is from the southwest side, from Holy Redeemer Parish. That's his roots, and that's his family. And he's the oldest of 13. And I'm sure that's where he learned his leadership skills. And I suspect some of the younger ones had to pay for it. But as a son of Holy Redeemer Parish, quite logically, the Cardinal then went to the seminary for the congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer. And in the congregation, he was given pastoral responsibilities. One of the most important for our experience is the Cardinal himself was pastor of Holy Redeemer Parish. And so we can proudly say that he was a member of the presbyterate of this archdiocese. And that's something that, Your Eminence, we're very, very grateful for. In the congregation, he was given positions of leadership and eventually became the successor of St. Alphonsus Liguori, which I suppose is intimidating. Because of the talent he showed, the Cardinal has been called to serve the wider church. He was made the Archbishop Secretary, which is in effect the Chief Operating Officer of the Congregation for Consecrated Life and Apostolic Life, that group that assists the Holy Father in sustaining men and women religious. And from that, the Cardinal became the Archbishop of Indianapolis, and most recently was transferred to the not easy see of Newark. We know that. But he's doing that with great confidence in the power of God's good providence. And of course, our Holy Father has recognized the talent that the Cardinal brings to the pastoral ministry by making him one of his closest co-workers and naming him a member of the College of Cardinals. And you heard already from what Jeff said that one of the things the Cardinal is most proud of is being an alumnus of Guest House. And it is for that I find him a most exemplary pastor, and I have seen how it has shaped his priestly life. And so, from all of us here in the Detroit area, let's welcome one of our own, Cardinal Joseph Tobin.
The kindness of Archbishop makes me feel like the Irish widow that was at her husband's funeral. And she heard the parish priest extolling all of her husband's virtues. And she elbowed one of her kids and said, "Open the box and see who's in there." I'm indebted to Archbishop for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons took place just a year ago this month. I was privileged to accompany the priests of this archdiocese in days of reflection and prayer up in, and some fun as well, up in Boy Mountain. It was a convocation of the priests of the archdiocese. And since a lot of those priests there were my mentors as a young priest, I felt really honored, and I felt at home because, you know, these are Motown priests, and I could share some of the more intimate thoughts in my heart. And I began by sharing with them one of the great traumas of my life. which took place in Newark, surprisingly enough, on a Sunday when I had just finished the Spanish Mass in the cathedral. Going down the aisle, I saw a little girl kind of waving, gesturing to me. So I knelt down beside her, and she spoke English. I said, "What's up?" And she froze me with her look. It was somewhere between deep disappointment and utter disgust. She said, "Why don't you take off your own hat?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, "Nobody told me." And I think you could see, and if you were at St. Hugo of the Hills for that beautiful liturgy this evening, I don't manage that hat very well by myself. In fact, when I was ordained a bishop 10 years ago this month, 10 years ago last week at St. Peter's in Rome, my boss in the Vatican was one of the co-consecrators. And afterwards he said, he didn't say congratulations or many years. He said, "You better learn how to take care of that hat." Yeah, I've got a lot of, but the hat business really isn't one of the great challenges that I've faced. I'd like to situate this spiritual journey that you make possible for us who find healing and life at Guest House. I'd like to situate it in kind of the circumstances that we're all going through in this as a nation. What's these last 6-7 months been like? And as a pandemic swept across the country. It hit our archdiocese very hard in Newark. I think in the month of April and the beginning of May, if those 4 counties that I serve, which have about 1.5 million Catholics, if we had been a country, we would have been 5th in the world in terms of infections and deaths. Lost priests to COVID. Mother houses were burying their dead. And if you ask me what it was like, well, you shared it. And I hope you would at least bear with me. I think it was an intense, gut-wrenching experience of isolation. And isolation at every level of our lives. Physical isolation, where people were separated from their families. Their loved ones were dying and they couldn't be with them. They couldn't pray with them. Sometimes a kind first responder would put a cell phone on somebody's shoulder as they were dying. It's a physical separation. We couldn't, I know my own family, we couldn't visit our 97-year-old mother. And we would occasionally inflict a Zoom call on her that I'm sure the poor thing would stare at the screen. And I think she thought it was a perverse version of Hollywood Squares. And she looked at each of those bodies in each square and wondered if she really gave birth to them all. There was an emotional separation. Emotional because we couldn't see an end to it. And perhaps we still can't. It was a distorting influence on our everyday lives. I was talking with my sister Molly on the way out here today, and I said, "Do you ever catch yourself not knowing what month it is? Because the markers have been removed that told us it's fall. It's the beginning of school. It's the first football game. Labor Day weekend. It all has kind of merged into a vague fog around us. And there's the spiritual isolation. And I think this was eviscerating for deacons, priests, and bishops to realize the very reason why we followed Christ in this vocation, apparently, couldn't be exercised. When we had to shut our churches, there were people that wrote to me. I do get some letters, Jack, so don't. And among other things, they were saying, you don't love the Mass. And I wanted to write back and say, yeah, that's why I became a priest, because I don't love the Mass. But I understood it. I heard the anguish of children that couldn't bury their parents, and parents that couldn't bury their children. The sacraments were ripped away from us, and we had to find a different way of being church. I think the icon of this isolation, for me, came late in March, the last Friday of March, the 27th of March, when our Holy Father had a prayer service in St. Peter's Square. I don't know if you saw it. It's probably on YouTube someplace. But I have to say, I was in my office crying, watching this. Seeing this frail elderly man walking by himself. You never see the Pope walking by himself, ever in Rome. Rain pouring down, praying for the world. And I've been told that 11 million people watched that prayer service. Listened to him give his message, urbi et orbi, to the city and to the world, usually reserved for joyous occasions, like Christmas and New Year's. And in his opening remarks, he said, for weeks now, it has been evening. Thick darkness has gathered over our squares, our streets, and our cities. The darkness has taken over our lives. The darkness has taken over our lives. My dear friends, that is the experience of active addiction. It is an isolating disease. Around the tables of AA, we say it has to get us alone in order to kill us. It's a disease that tells us and kills us by insisting that we don't have it. The darkness has taken over our lives. And we are ultimately disconnected from our families, from our friends, from our parishioners, from our ideals, our highest ideals. And the spiritual disconnect is probably the most painful. I recall in the first few weeks at Guest House, late in the October of 1987. After I got over the initial shame and quit crying, I kind of liked it. You know, the phone didn't ring. Could read paperbacks. Had to show up for a few things. But the counselors were uniformly kind. And the staff was respectful. And they kept saying there and in our first AA meetings, we'll love you until you can love yourself. I thought, I might like to stay here for a while. Until a Friday afternoon. I remember after lunch going back to my room and sitting in a chair thinking I'm going to pick up one of those paperbacks and have a look at it. And you have to understand, there was one disquieting thought through this calmness and this peace. You saw a big book that said Alcoholics Anonymous. We call it the Big Book. It's in its 4th or 5th edition right now, since 1935. It's the experience of AA, and it's an explanation of the 12 steps, and it's testimony of these first men and women who got sober in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And early on in the book, the authors make it clear, no one is healed without a spiritual experience. And that made me really nervous. I said, I don't do spiritual experiences. I'll haul food baskets, or I'll visit the jails. But for me, much of spirituality was a theory. It was something I learned. And the longest journey, as most of us experience, is between our head and our heart. So with that in mind, that Friday afternoon, before I could pick up a paperback, I had something like a spiritual experience. And it was awful. It was the experience of the worst of Joe Tobin, and color and with Dolby sound. I saw all of the cowardice, all of the compromise, all of the fear, all the pride, the arrogance that I'd accumulated in 35 years of life. And what made me close to despair, brought me close to despair, was the knowledge that a lot of that was with me before I ever picked up a drink. And I thought, I'll never be better. I didn't go to Mass that afternoon. We had Mass at 5 o'clock. I went to supper, not because I had any appetite, but for all of that beauty, a guest house is still a treatment center. And if you don't show up for a meal, they'll hunt you down like a dog and drag you into the dining room. And I thought, whatever pride I had left didn't allow that. So I went down and thinking that you'll never be better. And somewhere at the beginning of that meal, pushing some salad around on my plate, there was this awareness. Of course you'll never be better by yourself. But that's why there's God. And the initial connection was made. You know, the first word of the 12 steps is, you know what it is? We admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become, what is it? Unmanageable. Thank you. It's a we program. And the rest of the 12 steps, it's all written in the first person plural. Because the gift of sobriety reestablishes the essential connections of our life. The connection with God. But that connection comes through others. The staff and the counselors, your fellow patients, the men and women of Alcoholics Anonymous from across the world. And the we begins to heal us. The we makes God's grace possible. Austin Ripley, as you heard, was concerned about the priests that he had met, not only in bars, but also in AA. After Austin got sober during World War II in Chicago, he rediscovered his Catholic faith. And he would notice occasionally a priest would show up at an AA meeting, but they rarely stayed. Something was keeping them from getting the healing, and the light was coming through the 12 steps. And so why Ripley began Guest House, as I understand it, was to make it possible for priests to enter AA and stay. That meant a certain amount of humility, because whatever they told you when you left the seminary, you didn't have all the answers. Whatever you learned in class didn't give you the spirituality that is necessary to sustain the gift of sobriety. And guest house is because it is all lay people. Yes, nurtures and respects and heals, but they teach us the way to God, the way to each other, and reestablish us. Pope Francis said in those remarks on March 27th in that dark St. Peter's Square, the pandemic has reminded us that we are all in the same boat. The storm exposes our vulnerability and uncovers those false and superfluous certainties about which we have constructed our daily schedules. And now that we are in a stormy sea, we implore you, wake up, Lord, wake up. Guest house is a place of connection. It's a place of awakening, where it really isn't the Lord who wakes up. It's me. It's the others. It's all of us who are connected. We discover we are in the same boat. We not only share the same disease, but we share the same redemption. I experience that when I go to my home group now, which is Forest Hills. It's a Monday night group in Belleville, New Jersey. Very interesting group. Most of the people are men whose names end in a vowel and who have had all expense-paid trips to federal institutions. But I learn from them, and I do what I can to help them. The connections we experience remind me of an essential connection that we read about in the Gospel of Luke. It's the alcoholic story. It's about the 10 lepers. If you remember the story that Jesus encounters, 10 lepers stood at a distance as he entered the town. Stood at a distance because their disease separated them. And they could not breach that chasm by themselves. Under pain of death, they had to stay separate. And it was a separation not simply from their family and their friends and their livelihood. It was a separation from their God because they couldn't go to the synagogue. And they were forbidden from the temple. It was a separation like alcoholism. On a physical, on an emotional, and on a spiritual basis. I saw a modern example of that years ago, visiting my confreres in the Amazon Valley. And on these riverboats that go up and down the Amazon, I saw one in the distance pulling a little boat. And I said to one of the Brazilians, "Who are those people in the little boat?" And he said, "They're the lepers. They can't, they're not permitted to be in the same boat with everybody else." That's what we look like when we came to Lake Orion. We were brought back into the boat, the fullness of the life of the church, because of the healing grace we received. We were reconnected. But if you remember the story, the 10 were healed, and one came back. What did Jesus not do? I think that is always an interesting question when we read the Word of God. What did he not do? He didn't go, "You got it back for you other 9. But it says he was sad. He said, "We're not 10 made whole. Why is it only one returned? And that one was a foreigner, a Samaritan. He was sad because the other 9 went back to their families, went back to their communities, resumed their job, but they missed the connection. They didn't know whom to thank. And so why I'm back here today, besides my love for my family and my city, I'm one that wants to say thank you to you who support this place of healing, this place of reconnection, this place of new life. And the connections we made at Guest House go far beyond this life. One of the fellows that arrived probably when I was halfway through the 90-day program was a lovely African priest by the name of Medard from Tanzania. Never had seen snow before. Had nothing to really clothe himself. So one of the counselors said, "You got some connections in Detroit." Actually, one of the great benefactors in this Let's Clothe Father Medard project was Black Jack Kelly. If you remember Jack Kelly from the Jack knew the saloons, so maybe I met him in one or two. And he was very generous. He used his connections to bring in a lot of clothes. And Medard and I became good friends. And I left Guest House to return to Holy Redeemer and resume a new life of pastoral service. Medard stayed a little longer. And then he went to a parish because he had burned his bridges in Tanzania. And the Marino fathers who had befriended him thought it'd be better if he stayed for a little longer in Detroit while he could work out something with his diocese. Gentle, kind man. Medard went to one of the parishes out in Redford and he had a spectacular slip. Was back in Guest House because they'd resumed drinking. And I used to go up there on my, make a monthly retreat day, talk to my confessor, do other things. Talking to my counselor, and he said, Medard got along really well with you. Would you take him in at Holy Redeemer? I said, sure. I talked to the community, and I said, he's a really good guy. And he fit right in. Spent most of the time in chapel. Was friendly to and kind and soft-spoken. But he was sick. And one day, when I was up talking to my counselor, he happened to say, we're really having to scramble to find the money for the interferon. I said, pardon me? And he said, oh my God. He said, you come up here so often, I thought you were one of the staff. I said, but did you say interferon? And he said, yeah. He said he has AIDS. And I said, oh. I called my provincial superior and I said, I didn't know this, but I don't think he's a danger to any of us. Can he stay? And the provincial said, yes. You can have him stay and you don't need to upset the community. And he got sicker and he was hospitalized. Well, he was experiencing a physical isolation because of his disease, but he was still connected. And his sister, who was a religious, taught at the University of Dar es Salaam, came to stay with him. And I remember every time I'd come to see her, she was kneeling at the foot of his bed with her arms stretched out, praying for her brother. And one day I got a phone call saying that Father's dying. If you want to see him again, if you want to anoint him, please come. So I went there, and Medard was restrained. He was semi-conscious. And you have to know that Medard never really mastered English. I mean, I think English was his third language, after his tribal language, and then Kiswahili, the national language. And he was babbling in his native language. And when I put my hands on his head as the beginning of the anointing, he suddenly quiet. And in the clearest dark, said, yes, Joe, we'll be together again someday. And I prayed to Medard to help me. So the gift the guest house has given me is a gift of connection with my family, with my church, with my God, with the community of saints. What our country's suffering is a pandemic of disconnection and a pandemic of division. I had a note from somebody who doesn't have a last name, Francis, a couple of weeks ago. And he said, no one ever emerges from a crisis the same. We either emerge better or we emerge worse. And this is our biggest challenge. Guest House shows us the way forward by turning to God and asking God to reconnect us with each other as a church, as a nation, as citizens of this planet. And for the connections already made, those of us who know what leprosy feels like, we come back. And to all of you, we say, thank you. God bless you.